In the unforgiving wilderness of 1870s Arizona territory, where the sun scorched the earth and survival meant choosing between honor and death, a young woman's desperate cry would echo through canyon walls and change the fate of 3 lives forever. This is not just another tale of the Old West. This is the true story of Sarah McKenna, a frontier woman whose refusal to surrender her freedom sparked a deadly confrontation between 2 worlds, 2 men, and 2 codes of honor that could never coexist. What happens when civilization meets the wild? When a woman's voice becomes the catalyst for a battle that will determine not just who lives or dies, but what it truly means to belong to someone in a land where the strongest survive. The answer lies in the dust and blood of the Arizona desert, where an Apache warrior's arrow would decide more than just one woman's fate. This is her story. This is their story. This is the story of how love, honor, and freedom collided in the most dangerous territory in America, and why sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bow, but a woman who refuses to be owned by anyone. Sarah McKenna pressed her back against the rough wooden seat of the stagecoach as it lurched violently over another deep rut in the desert road. The Arizona territory stretched endlessly beyond the dust-covered windows, a harsh landscape of red rock formations and thorny vegetation that seemed to mock any human attempt at civilization. She clutched her small leather satchel tighter, feeling the weight of the gold coins sewn into its lining. Everything she owned in the world was either in that bag or wearing on her back. The other passengers had long since given up trying to make conversation. Mrs. Heartfelt, an elderly widow traveling to Phoenix to live with her son, dozed fitfully in the corner, her grey head bobbing with each jolt of the coach. Across from Sarah sat James Morrison, a young banker from Boston who kept checking his pocket watch and muttering about being late for important business meetings. His starched collar had wilted hours ago in the desert heat, and sweat stains darkened his expensive suit despite his attempts to remain dignified. Sarah had boarded the stagecoach 3 days ago in Tucson with high hopes and desperate determination. At 22, she had already buried 1 husband and refused 2 marriage proposals from men who saw her more as property than as a person. The teaching position in Prescott represented freedom, a chance to support herself with her education rather than her appearance, to make decisions about her own future rather than having them made for her. The driver, a weathered man named Pete Collins who had been running mail and passengers through Apache country for 15 years, suddenly called down from his perch above them. "Folks, we're coming up on Devil's Canyon. Keep your heads down and stay quiet for the next hour or so." Apache had been spotted in this area. Sarah's blood chilled. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Apache were fighting desperately to hold on to their ancestral lands as more and more settlers poured into the territory. The newspapers back east painted them as savage monsters. But Sarah had met enough frontier people to know that the truth was usually more complicated than what the papers printed. James Morrison immediately began checking his pistol, a nervous habit that had increased with each mile they traveled deeper into the wilderness. "Perhaps we should have waited for a military escort," he whispered to no one in particular. Mrs. Heartfelt opened her eyes and fixed him with a stern look. "Young man, if we waited for the army every time someone spotted Indians, we'd never get anywhere. Pete knows these roads better than anyone." But even she seemed nervous as she peered out the window at the towering rock formations that surrounded them. Devil's Canyon was aptly named. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side of the narrow road, creating perfect hiding spots for anyone who might want to ambush travelers. The coach wheels echoed strangely in the confined space, and even the constant desert wind seemed muffled here. Sarah found herself thinking about her late husband, Michael. He had died of fever 2 years ago, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay, and a future that seemed to offer only the charity of relatives or marriage to men who promised security in exchange for obedience. She had sold everything of value, taken her small savings, and bought a train ticket west. Teaching school might not make her wealthy, but it would make her independent. The coach suddenly jerked to a violent stop, throwing all the passengers forward. Sarah heard Pete Collins cursing above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of rifles being cocked. Her heart began pounding as she realized their worst fears were coming true. "Everyone stay calm," Pete called down, but his voice carried a tension that contradicted his words. "We've got company." Through the window, Sarah could see shapes moving among the rocks. Men on horseback, painted for war, with weapons that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Apache warriors, just as the stories described, but somehow more real and more human than she had expected. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of absolute mastery of this harsh environment. James Morrison's hand shook as he raised his pistol, but Mrs. B's. Heartfelt grabbed his wrist. "Don't be a fool," she hissed. "There are at least a dozen of them. You'll only get us all killed. One of the Apache warriors rode closer to the coach, and Sarah got her first clear look at him. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with long black hair and markings painted across his face in red and yellow. His eyes were intelligent and alert as they swept over the coach, taking in every detail. When his gaze met hers through the window, she felt a strange jolt of recognition, as if she were looking at someone she had known in another life. Pete Collins climbed down from the driver's seat, his hands raised but his rifle still within reach. The lead Apache warrior dismounted and approached him. They spoke in a mixture of Apache and broken English, their voices too low for the passengers to hear clearly, but the tension in their postures was unmistakable. Sarah watched the negotiation with growing dread. She had heard enough frontier stories to know that stagecoach robberies often ended badly for everyone involved. The Apache were not interested in money or personal belongings. They wanted the passengers to leave their territory and never return. The young warrior she had noticed earlier remained on his horse, but his attention seemed focused on the coach rather than the conversation between his leader and Pete. Sarah felt his eyes on her again and found herself unable to look away. There was something in his expression that was not hatred or cruelty, but rather a kind of intense curiosity. The discussion between Pete and the Apache leader grew more heated. Sarah could see Pete shaking his head repeatedly, gesturing toward the coach and then toward the road ahead. The Apache leader's responses became sharper, more insistent. Other warriors began moving restlessly, checking their weapons and exchanging glances. James Morrison was sweating heavily now, despite the shade inside the coach. "They're going to kill us all," he whispered. "I should never have come to this godforsaken territory." "Hush," Mrs. Hartwell commanded. But even she looked pale and frightened. Sarah felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching these events happen to someone else. Perhaps it was the shock of the situation, or perhaps it was the exhaustion of 3 days of difficult travel. But she found herself studying the Apache warriors with an almost academic interest. They were nothing like the savage monsters described in the newspapers. They moved with purpose and discipline, and their attention to their leader showed respect rather than fear. The young warrior who had been watching her suddenly spoke to the leader in rapid Apache. The older man turned to look at the coach, his gaze settling on Sarah's face in the window. They spoke briefly, and then the leader nodded. Pete Collins looked back at the coach with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly, but also something that might have been pity. He walked slowly back to them, his hand still raised in a gesture of peace. "Folks," he said quietly, "I'm going to need you all to step out of the coach. Slowly, and with your hands where they can see them. No sudden movements, and for God's sake, don't try to run." Mrs. Hartwell was the first to move, gathering her small bag and stepping carefully down from the coach. James Morrison followed, his face pale and his hands trembling. Sarah came last, feeling strangely calm despite the dangerous situation. As her feet touched the dusty ground, she looked up to see the young Apache warrior watching her intently. The leader spoke to Pete again, pointing at each of the passengers in turn. Pete nodded grimly and turned to address them. "They want to know why we're traveling through their land," he said. "I've explained about the mail route and the passenger service, but they're not satisfied. There have been problems with other travelers recently, people who came here to take land that doesn't belong to them." Sarah stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Tell them we mean no harm," she said clearly. "We're just passing through." The young warrior's attention sharpened at the sound of her voice. He dismounted and walked closer, never taking his eyes off her face. When he was only a few feet away, he spoke to her directly, in careful English. "You speak for the others?" he asked. Sarah felt rather than saw the surprise of her companions. She nodded slowly. "I speak for myself. I'm a teacher, traveling to Prescott to start a new job. I have no interest in taking anyone's land or causing trouble." The warrior studied her for a long moment, then turned to address his leader in Apache. Their conversation was animated, with frequent glances in Sarah's direction. She had the uncomfortable feeling that she had somehow become the center of attention in a way that might not end well for any of them. James Morrison chose that moment to make a fatal mistake. Whether from panic or misguided heroism, he suddenly lunged for the rifle Pete had left propped against the coach wheel. His movement was clumsy and obvious, and before he could even reach the weapon, 3 Apache arrows had found their mark. Morrison fell to the ground with a cry of pain and fear, blood spreading across his white shirt. He was still alive, but badly wounded and completely helpless. Mrs. Hartwell screamed and pressed herself against the side of the coach. The Apache leader's expression hardened, and he spoke sharply to his warriors. Several of them raised their weapons, and Sarah realized that Morrison's foolish action had doomed them all. In a few seconds, this remote canyon would become their grave. But the young warrior who had been talking to her suddenly stepped between his leader and the passengers. He spoke rapidly and urgently in Apache, his hands moving expressively as he made his point. The leader listened, then responded in what sounded like a question. The younger man nodded emphatically and continued his argument. Sarah found herself holding her breath as she watched this debate that would determine whether she lived or died. The young warrior seemed to be arguing for their lives, but she couldn't understand why he would care what happened to a group of strangers, unless it wasn't about all of them. Unless it was specifically about her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The way he had been watching her, the questions about whether she spoke for the others, the sudden intervention when violence seemed inevitable, it was all connected. For some reason she couldn't begin to understand, this Apache warrior had decided she was worth protecting. The discussion between the two men grew more intense, with other warriors occasionally adding their voices to the debate. Sarah caught fragments of English mixed in with the Apache words, woman, teacher, passage, but not enough to understand what was being decided. Mrs. Hartwell had gone to James Morrison and was trying to stop his bleeding with strips torn from her petticoat. He was conscious but in obvious pain, his face grey with shock. Pete Collins stood frozen between the passengers and the Apache, clearly afraid that any movement might trigger more violence. Finally, the Apache leader raised his hand for silence. He looked directly at Sarah and spoke in careful English. "The woman comes with us," he said. "The others may go." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. She had expected death, but this was somehow worse. She had heard the stories about white women taken by Indians, the years of captivity, the cultural changes that made it impossible for them to return to their former lives. Some were never seen again. Others came back so changed that their own families didn't recognize them. "No," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I won't go with you." The young warrior moved closer to her, and she could see something in his eyes that might have been pleading. He spoke to his leader again, more urgently this time. P. Collins cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't think you understand. This isn't a negotiation. These folks are offering to let the rest of us live if you go with them. That's more mercy than most Apache show to trespassers." Sarah looked around at her fellow travelers. Mrs. Hartwell was crying silently as she tended to Morrison's wounds. Morrison himself was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Pete looked like a man who had seen too much violence and just wanted to survive another day. She thought about the teaching position waiting for her in Prescott, about the independent life she had planned, about all the reasons she had come west in the first place. Then she thought about these people dying because she refused to sacrifice herself for them. But another part of her, the part that had refused 2 marriage proposals and chosen to travel alone into dangerous territory rather than accept a life of dependence, rebelled against the idea of becoming anyone's property. She had not come this far and risked this much to trade one form of captivity for another. "I refuse to be theirs," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the canyon air. "I won't be anyone's prisoner or property." The young Apache warrior's expression changed, and for a moment she thought she saw respect in his eyes. But then his leader spoke sharply, and several warriors raised their weapons again. The negotiation was apparently over. The young warrior looked at Sarah one more time, then turned to his leader and said something in a voice that carried the weight of finality. The older man's eyebrows rose in surprise, and he responded with what sounded like a question. The younger man nodded firmly and spoke again. Sarah watched this exchange with growing confusion and fear. Whatever was being decided, it clearly involved her, but she had no way of understanding what was happening or influencing the outcome. The Apache leader studied her for a long moment, then looked at his young warrior and spoke a single word that might have been a name. The younger man straightened and raised his bow, fitting an arrow to the string with smooth, practiced movements. Sarah closed her eyes, expecting to feel the arrow pierce her heart. Instead, she heard the young warrior's voice, speaking clearly in English for everyone to hear. "She is mine." The words hung in the desert air like thunder after lightning. Sarah opened her eyes to see the young Apache warrior still holding his bow. The arrow pointed not at her, but at his own leader. The older man's face showed a mixture of surprise and anger, but he made no move to challenge the younger warrior's claim. "My name is Takoda," the young warrior said, his English careful but clear. "You are under my protection now." Sarah felt her legs trembling, but she forced herself to remain standing. The situation had changed. but she wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. Being claimed by an individual Apache warrior might be preferable to being taken by the entire group, but it still meant captivity. It still meant losing the freedom she had traveled so far to find. The Apache leader spoke rapidly to Takoda in their native language, his tone sharp with questions and commands. Takoda responded, without lowering his bow, his voice steady and respectful, but firm. Other warriors began moving restlessly, clearly uncomfortable with the tension between their leaders. Pete Collins stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am," he said quietly to Sarah, "I think this young fellow just claimed you as his wife. That's about the only way an Apache warrior can protect someone from outside the tribe. It means the others can't touch you without challenging him directly." Sarah's mind reeled. Marriage to a stranger was exactly what she had fled from back east, but this was far worse than anything she had imagined. At least the men who had proposed to her spoke her language and understood her culture. This Apache warrior was completely unknown to her, from a world she couldn't begin to comprehend. But as she watched Takoda facing down his own leader to protect her, she realized that whatever his motivations, his actions showed a kind of courage and honor that the civilized men of her acquaintance often lacked. He was risking his own standing in the tribe, possibly his own life, for a woman he had just met. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. The Apache leader seemed to be testing Takoda's resolve, speaking to him in increasingly sharp tones. But the younger warrior never wavered, never lowered his weapon, never took his eyes off his leader's face. Finally, the older man made a gesture that seemed to indicate resignation or acceptance. He spoke a few words to the other warriors, then turned his horse and rode away without another glance at the stagecoach passengers. The other Apache followed him, leaving only Takoda behind. Sarah found herself alone with a man who had just claimed her as his wife, while her fellow travelers watched from beside the coach like spectators at a play they didn't understand. Mrs. Hartwell had stopped crying but continued to tend to James Morrison, who was drifting in and out of consciousness from his wounds. Takoda slowly lowered his bow and turned to face Sarah. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, probably not much older than herself. His face was strong and angular, marked by exposure to sun and wind, but his eyes held an intelligence and sensitivity that surprised her. "You are afraid," he said simply. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I'm afraid. But I'm also angry. I didn't come to this territory to become someone's property, whether it's an Apache warrior or a Boston banker." Takoda's expression showed confusion. "Property? I do not understand this word in this way." Pete Collins cleared his throat. "Miss McKenna, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Apache marriage customs are different from ours. The man might claim a woman for protection, but she still has rights and choices that our own wives often don't have." Sarah looked skeptically at Pete, then back at Takoda. "Is that true? If I go with you, do I have a choice about what happens to me?" Takoda considered this carefully before answering. "Among my people, a woman chooses her own path in many things. A husband protects and provides, but he does not own. You would be my wife, but you would also be yourself." The concept was foreign to Sarah's experience, but intriguing. In her world, marriage meant that a woman's property, her decisions, even her thoughts became subject to her husband's control. What Takoda described sounded almost like the independence she had been seeking, albeit in a form she had never imagined. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Takoda looked back toward where his leader and the other warriors had disappeared. "Then you continue on your journey, and my people will consider you enemies. They will hunt you and kill you before you reach the next settlement." Mrs. Hartwell spoke up from beside Morrison. "My dear, I don't think you have much choice. At least this young man seems willing to protect you. That's more than we could expect from most men in this situation." Sarah felt trapped between impossible options. Stay with the stagecoach and face almost certain death from pursuing Apache warriors, or go with Takoda into a life she couldn't begin to understand. Neither choice offered the independence and security she had sought in coming west. But as she looked at Takoda's face, she realized that his situation was not much better than hers. He had sacrificed his position in the tribe to protect her, had challenged his own leader, and isolated himself from his people. In a harsh environment where survival often depended on group cooperation, he had chosen to make himself an outsider. "Why?" she asked him. "Why did you do this for a stranger?" Takoda was quiet for a long time, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched beyond the canyon walls. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were translating not just language but concepts that had no equivalent in English.
"In my dreams, I have seen a woman with yellow hair who would bring change to my life.
When I saw you in the coach, I knew you were the one from my dreams. Among my people, such dreams are not ignored. Sarah touched her blonde hair self-consciously. In her practical world of school teaching and business transactions, dreams were pleasant diversions, not reasons for life-changing decisions. But she had met enough frontier people to know that many cultures took such visions seriously. What kind of change? She asked. I do not know. Dreams show pictures, not explanations. But I believe you are meant to be part of my path, as I am meant to be part of yours. The mystical nature of his explanation frustrated Sarah, but she couldn't deny that something unusual had brought them together. Of all the stagecoaches traveling through Apache territory, of all the passengers who might have been on board, she had been the one to catch Dakota's attention. And of all the Apache warriors who might have encountered their coach, he had been the one willing to sacrifice everything to protect her. Pete Collins was becoming increasingly nervous about remaining in one place for too long. Miss McKenna, I hate to pressure you, but we need to make some decisions here. Morrison needs medical attention, and we're still in the middle of Apache territory. If you're going with this fellow, we need to get moving so we can reach the next settlement before dark. Sarah looked at Morrison, whose face was now completely grey. His wounds were serious, and without proper medical care he might not survive. Mrs. Dad. Hartwell had done what she could, but she was not a doctor, and her supplies were limited. Can your people help him? Sarah asked Takuda, indicating Morrison. Dakota knelt beside the wounded man and examined his injuries carefully. Morrison was unconscious now, his breathing shallow and irregular. After a few minutes, Dakota stood and shook his head. The wounds are too deep, and he has lost too much blood. Even our medicine men could not save him now. He will die before the sun sets. Mrs. Hartwell began crying again. He was such a young man, with so much to live for. All he wanted was to make his fortune in the territory and send for his sweetheart back in Boston. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the senseless waste of life. Morrison had died because he panicked, because he couldn't trust others to handle the situation, because he thought violence was the answer to fear. In that way, he was like so many men she had known, quick to use force, slow to consider consequences. But Dakota had been different. When faced with conflict, he had chosen protection over violence, sacrifice over self-interest. He had found a way to save lives rather than take them, even at great cost to himself. If I go with you, Sarah said to Dakota, what happens to them? She indicated Pete and Mrs. Hartwell. They continue their journey. My people will not pursue them if they leave quickly and do not return to this territory. Pete nodded grimly. That's about the best we can hope for, Miss McKenna. Mrs. Hartwell and I can get Morrison to Prescott, though I'm afraid it will be too late for him. The important thing is that you have a chance to survive. Sarah realized that Dakota was offering her more than survival. He was offering her a choice. She could continue with the stagecoach and face almost certain death, or she could trust a stranger who had already proven his willingness to sacrifice for her welfare. Neither option was what she had planned, but one offered hope, while the other offered only fear. She thought about her teaching position, waiting in Prescott, about the independence she had sought, about the life she had planned to build for herself. All of that seemed very far away now, less important than the immediate question of survival. But perhaps survival could lead to something else, something she had never considered possible. If I go with you, she said to Dakota, do you promise to respect my choices about my own life? Do you promise not to force me into anything I don't want to do? Dakota's expression was serious as he considered her question. Among my people, a husband and wife make decisions together. I cannot promise you the same life you would have had among your people, but I can promise you will be treated with honor and given the respect due to a warrior's wife. It wasn't the independence Sarah had dreamed of, but it was more autonomy than most married women of her acquaintance enjoyed. And there was something in Dakota's manner that suggested he meant what he said. He had already shown himself willing to stand against his own people to protect her choices. Mrs. Hartwell struggled to her feet and approached Sarah. My dear, she said quietly, I've been married for 40 years, and I can tell you that most husbands promise respect, and then forget about it once the wedding is over. But this young man has already proven he's willing to sacrifice for you. That's worth more than all the pretty words in the world. Pete Collins was checking Morrison's pulse and shaking his head. Miss McKenna, I'm sorry, but we really do need to decide soon. Morrison is fading fast, and we need to get out of this canyon before more Apache show up. Sarah looked around at the harsh desert landscape, at the towering canyon walls that seemed to trap them all in this moment of decision. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the marriage proposals she had refused, about the dreams of independence that had driven her west. None of this was what she had planned. That perhaps that was the nature of the frontier. It forced people to make choices they had never imagined, to become people they had never thought they could be. She had come west seeking freedom and found something she couldn't define, something that might be better or worse than freedom, but was certainly different. She looked at Takoda, who was waiting patiently for her decision without pressure or persuasion. He had made his choice when he claimed her as his wife. Now the choice was hers. "I'll go with you," she said quietly. Takoda's expression showed relief, but also something that might have been happiness. "You will not regret this," he said. "I already regret it," Sarah replied honestly. "But I regret all my choices right now. At least this one offers hope for tomorrow." Pete Collins was already loading Morrison's unconscious form back into the stagecoach with Mrs. Hartwell's help. "Miss McKenna," he said, "I'll make sure word gets to Prescott about what happened here. Your name won't be forgotten." Sarah gathered her few belongings from the coach, including the leather satchel with her gold coins. Everything she owned in the world now fit in one small bag, and she was about to follow a strange man into an unknown life, in one of the most dangerous territories in America. But, as she looked at Takoda preparing to lead her away from everything familiar, she realized that for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something other than fear about the future. It wasn't exactly hope, and it certainly wasn't confidence, but it was a kind of curious anticipation about what might come next. The stagecoach pulled away with Mrs. Hartwell waving goodbye through the window and Morrison lying still on the seat beside her. Sarah watched until it disappeared around a bend in the canyon, taking with it her last connection to the world she had known. Then she turned to face Takoda, who was mounting his horse and extending his hand to help her up behind him. As she settled herself on the horse's back, holding onto Takoda's waist for balance, she wondered if she would ever see another white face again, if she would ever sleep in a proper bed, or eat familiar food, or speak English with someone who truly understood her meaning. But those fears seemed less important than the immediate reality of warm sunlight on her face, strong arms protecting her from falling, and the vast open desert ahead of them full of possibilities she had never dreamed. Whatever came next, it would be her choice to make. The Apache village appeared in the distance like a mirage shimmering in the afternoon heat. Sarah had been riding behind Takoda for hours, her arms aching from holding onto his waist, her body unused to the constant movement of the horse. The desert landscape had gradually given way to higher ground dotted with pine trees and carved by numerous small streams, but it was still the most remote and wild place she had ever seen. As they approached the village, Sarah could see that it consisted of perhaps 30 dwellings, made of brush and hide, scattered around a natural clearing near a flowing stream. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and she could hear the voices of children playing and women working. It looked peaceful and domestic, not at all like the savage war camp she had expected from the newspaper stories back east. But as their horse entered the village, the peaceful activity stopped abruptly. Women looked up from their cooking pots and men emerged from their shelters to stare at the unusual sight of one of their warriors returning with a white woman. Children peered out from behind their mother's skirts, their dark eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Takoda dismounted and helped Sarah down from the horse, keeping his hand on her arm in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the entire village gathered to examine this disruption to their normal life. Sarah felt like an exotic animal on display, conspicuous in her dusty traveling dress and pale skin. An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd, her grey hair braided with colored beads and her weathered face marked by years of desert sun. She spoke rapidly to Takoda in Apache, her tone clearly questioning and possibly angry. He responded respectfully but firmly, occasionally glancing at Sarah as if to include her in the conversation. "She is my grandmother," Takoda explained to Sarah quietly. "She asks why I bring a white woman to our village when her people make war on us." Sarah felt the weight of hostile stares from the gathered Apache. She could understand their suspicion and anger. White settlers were taking their land, the cavalry was hunting their warriors, and now one of their own had brought the enemy directly into their home. If the situations were reversed, she would probably feel the same way. "What should I tell her?" Sarah asked. Takoda considered this. "Tell her you come in peace, that you wish to learn our ways and become part of our people." The words felt strange in Sarah's mouth, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "I come in peace. I wish to learn your ways." The elderly woman studied Sarah for a long moment, then spoke again to Takoda. Their conversation continued for several minutes, with other village members occasionally adding their voices to the discussion. Sarah caught a few words that might have been English, but mostly she could only judge the mood by tone and gesture. Finally, Dakota turned to her with an expression that mixed relief with concern. "My grandmother says you may stay, but you must prove yourself worthy to be the wife of a warrior. She will teach you our customs and test your ability to live as one of our people." A young woman about Sarah's age stepped forward from the crowd, her beautiful face marked by suspicion and what might have been jealousy. She spoke to Dakota in a voice sharp enough to cut stone, gesturing repeatedly at Sarah with obvious displeasure. "Who is she?" Sarah asked. Dakota's expression became uncomfortable. "Her name is Ayana. She expected to become my wife when the time was right for me to marry. My choice to claim you instead has caused difficulty for her family." Sarah felt a new wave of guilt and anxiety. Not only had she disrupted Dakota's relationship with his tribe, but she had also ruined another woman's future plans. The situation was becoming more complicated with each revelation, and she was starting to understand just how many lives her presence would affect. Ayana continued her sharp-voiced protest, and several other young women joined in what seemed to be a chorus of complaints. Dakota listened patiently but answered firmly, his tone suggesting that his decision was final regardless of their objections. The elderly woman finally spoke sharply to the protesting group, and they fell silent, though their expressions remained hostile. She then approached Sarah and began speaking in careful English. "I am called grandmother by all in this village," she said. "You are now daughter to me, but you must earn this name. Apache women are strong, brave, wise. White women are often weak and foolish. We will see which kind you are." The blunt assessment stunned, but Sarah forced herself to remain calm. "I understand. I'm willing to learn and work to earn my place here." Grandmother nodded approvingly at this response. "Good. First lesson. Apache women speak truth, always. No pretty words to hide real meaning. You speak truth to me." Sarah thought about the careful diplomacy she had learned in her former life, the polite lies that smooth social interactions, the feminine arts of indirection and suggestion. Apparently, those skills would be useless here. "I speak the truth," she said. "I'm frightened and confused. I don't understand your customs or your language. I don't know if I can learn to live this way, but I'm grateful to Dakota for protecting me, and I want to try to be worthy of his sacrifice." Grandmother's stern expression softened slightly. "Better. Truth is always better than pretty lies. Come, I show you where you sleep, where you work. Tomorrow you begin learning." As they walked toward one of the brush shelters, Sarah became aware of the many eyes still watching her every movement. Some of the watchers seemed merely curious, but others clearly viewed her as an unwelcome intrusion. She wondered how long it would take to prove herself to these people, or if it would even be possible. The shelter grandmother led her to was small but surprisingly comfortable, with woven mats on the floor and baskets hanging from the frame. A fire pit in the center provided both heat and light, and the smoke escaped through an opening at the top. It was primitive by the standards Sarah was used to, but it was also clean and well organized. "This is women's place," grandmother explained. "Here you learn to make baskets, to prepare food, to work hides. Men's place is outside, hunting and protecting. Both important, both needed." Sarah looked around at the tools and materials stored in the shelter, trying to understand what her new life would involve. She had never done any of the work grandmother described, had never even imagined needing such skills. Her education had prepared her for teaching school children, not surviving in the desert. "What if I can't learn these things?" she asked honestly. Grandmother's eyes showed what might have been amusement. "Then you starve, and Dakota finds new wife. Desert does not care about your feelings. Apache does not keep people who cannot help tribes survive." The harsh reality was sobering but somehow also liberating. Here, at least, there would be no pretense or social games. Either she would learn to be useful, or she would fail. The choice was entirely up to her effort and determination. As evening approached, Dakota appeared at the shelter entrance. He had changed into traditional Apache clothing and looked more at home than Sarah had yet seen him. The transformation made her realize how much he had been adapting his appearance and behavior for her benefit during their journey. "How do you find our village?" he asked. Sarah considered her words carefully, remembering grandmother's lesson about truth-telling.
"It's overwhelming,"
she admitted. "Everything is different from what I know. But the people seem strong and capable. I can see why you're proud to be one of them." Dakota nodded, apparently pleased with her honesty. "Change is always difficult. But you showed courage when you chose to come with me. That same courage will help you learn our ways. What happens if I can't adapt? What happens if your people decide I don't belong here?" Takoda was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see that he was struggling with the same uncertainties that plagued her. "I do not know," he said finally. "I have never brought a white woman to our village before. But I believe my dreams guided me truly. I believe you are meant to be here." His faith in mystical guidance was both comforting and frightening. Sarah had always relied on practical planning and logical thinking to navigate life's challenges. The idea of trusting dreams and visions went against everything she had been taught about making sensible decisions. But as she looked around the Apache village, with its unfamiliar sights and sounds and customs, she realized that her old ways of thinking might not be adequate for this new life. Perhaps learning to trust intuition and accept uncertainty was part of the adaptation she would need to make. Grandmother returned to the shelter carrying bowls of food that smelled unlike anything Sarah had ever encountered. The mixture appeared to contain meat, vegetables, and grains, but the seasonings and preparation were completely foreign to her palate. Her stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since morning, so she accepted the bowl gratefully despite her hesitation about the unfamiliar flavors. The food was actually quite good, though it required some adjustment to appreciate the different combinations of tastes and textures. As she ate, Sarah found herself thinking about all the simple things she had taken for granted in her former life: familiar foods, shared language, understood social customs. Here, even the basic act of eating required conscious adaptation. As darkness settled over the village, she could hear the sounds of family life from neighboring shelters, quiet conversations, children's laughter, the ordinary domestic activities that made any community feel like home. The sounds were comforting, even though she couldn't understand the words being spoken. Takoda prepared to leave for his own shelter, and Sarah felt a moment of panic at the thought of being alone in this strange place. But grandmother seemed to understand her anxiety and settled herself nearby with some basket weaving work that could be done by firelight. "Takoda cannot stay here tonight," grandmother explained matter-of-factly. "You are not yet married in our way, so he must sleep in men's place.
Tomorrow we begin preparing for wedding ceremony, if you both choose to continue."
The reminder that her arrangement with Takoda was still tentative came as both relief and anxiety.
She was grateful not to be immediately forced into intimate contact with a man she barely knew, but she was also aware that her security in this village depended entirely on that relationship. If Takoda changed his mind about wanting to marry her, she would have no protection and no place to go. What does an Apache wedding involve? First, you must learn to be Apache woman. Then, families must agree to union. Then ceremony to bind you together before the spirits in the tribe. Not simple or quick like white marriages. Sarah found this information both daunting and reassuring. The extended process would give her time to learn and adapt, but it would also give Takoda and his family time to decide she wasn't suitable. The uncertainty was difficult to bear, but perhaps that was another lesson she needed to learn about living in the present moment rather than trying to control the future. As the evening progressed, other women began arriving at the shelter to examine the newcomer more closely. They spoke rapidly in Apache, occasionally directing questions at Sarah that grandmother translated. The conversation seemed to range from curiosity about white women's customs to practical concerns about Sarah's ability to contribute to village life. One middle-aged woman with intricate tattoos on her hands asked a long question that made grandmother laugh. She wants to know if white women really wear those cage things under their dresses to make their bodies look different, grandmother translated. She thinks this is very strange custom. Sarah found herself laughing as well, realizing how ridiculous some of her former lifestyle must seem to these women who lived such direct, practical lives. The elaborate undergarments, the restrictive clothing, the complex social rules about proper feminine behavior, all of it designed to limit women's movement and function rather than enhance it. Tell her that some white women do wear those things, but I'm hoping to learn better ways of dressing for this life, Sarah responded. The translated answer seemed to meet with approval from the gathered women, and the conversation became less formal and more friendly. Sarah began to feel that she might actually be able to find acceptance here, if she could prove herself willing to truly adapt rather than just endure until she could return to her former life. As the women prepared to return to their own families for the night, grandmother gave Sarah a final piece of advice. Sleep well, but do not expect comfortable rest. Tomorrow real work begins. Apache women rise before sun to prepare for day. No time for weakness or complaint. Left alone in the shelter with only the dying fire for company, Sarah wrapped herself in the blankets grandmother had provided and tried to process everything that had happened since morning. Less than 12 hours ago, she had been a passenger on a stagecoach traveling to a teaching job that represented independence and security. Now she was preparing to sleep in an Apache village as the intended bride of a warrior she had just met. The transformation was so complete and so rapid that it felt like a dream. that the physical discomfort of sleeping on the ground and the emotional stress of constant uncertainty were very real. She wondered if she would ever again take for granted the simple luxury of a soft bed and a secure future. But as she listened to the night sounds of the desert and the quiet activities of the village settling into sleep, she realized that she felt more alive and more present than she had in months. The constant need to adapt and respond to new challenges left no room for the kind of passive melancholy that had characterized her widowhood. Whatever else this experience might bring, it was forcing her to discover strengths and capabilities she had never known she possessed. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of women's voices and the crackle of newly lit fires throughout the village. Her entire body ached from sleeping on the ground, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was or why she felt so disoriented. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, along with the realization that this was not a strange dream, but her new reality. Grandmother appeared in the shelter entrance carrying a water gourd and what appeared to be traditional Apache women's clothing. "Time to begin," she said simply. "First, you learn to dress like Apache woman. White clothes mark you as enemy and stranger." The clothing was practical and well-made, consisting of a long dress decorated with colorful beadwork, soft moccasins, and a belt woven from plant fibers. As Sarah changed from her travel-stained Eastern clothing into these unfamiliar garments, she felt as though she was shedding one identity and taking on another. The Apache dress was more comfortable for moving and working than anything she had ever worn, but it also marked her irrevocably as someone who no longer belonged to the white world. "Better," Grandmother approved when Sarah had finished dressing. "Now you look less like lost white woman and more like Apache daughter who needs teaching." The day's lessons began immediately and intensively. Sarah learned to grind corn using stone tools that required strength and technique she had never developed. Her hands were soft from her previous life of teaching and light housework, and within an hour they were blistered and bleeding from the rough work. Grandmother observed her struggles without sympathy, but also without mockery. "Hands will become strong," she said matter-of-factly. "Pain means learning. Apache women endure pain without complaint because survival requires strength more than comfort." By midday, Sarah had also received instruction in water carrying, fire tending, and the basics of food preparation using unfamiliar ingredients and methods. Everything was harder than it looked, and she felt clumsy and inadequate compared to the Apache women who performed these tasks with effortless skill developed over lifetimes of practice. But the most difficult lesson was language. Grandmother insisted that Sarah begin learning Apache words immediately, correcting her pronunciation and requiring her to repeat phrases until she could say them properly. The sounds were unlike anything in English, and Sarah's tongue seemed incapable of forming some of the combinations Grandmother demanded. "Language is heart of people," Grandmother explained during a brief rest period. "Without our words, you cannot understand our thoughts or our ways. White people come to our lands and never learn our speech because they think their words are only important words. You must be different." The afternoon brought new challenges as several of the village women arrived to test Sarah's willingness to take on the more demanding aspects of Apache women's work. They brought her to where animal hides were being prepared for use, a process that involved scraping, treating with various substances, and working the leather until it became soft and flexible. The work was physical, messy, and required skills that took years to perfect. Ayana, the young woman who had expected to marry Takoda, was among the group of teachers. Her attitude towards Sarah had not improved overnight, and she seemed to take particular pleasure in assigning the most difficult and unpleasant tasks. When Sarah struggled with the proper technique for scraping a hide clean, Ayana spoke sharply in Apache to the other women, causing several of them to laugh. "What did she say?" Sarah asked Grandmother. "She says white women have soft hands because they are too weak and lazy to do real work. She says you will never learn because your people believe work is beneath them." Sarah felt her temper rising at the unfair characterization, but she forced herself to remain calm. Losing her composure would only confirm Ayana's opinion and damage her standing with the other women. Instead, she returned to the hide scraping with renewed determination, ignoring the pain in her blistered hands and the burning ache in her back and shoulders. As the hours passed, Sarah began to understand that this was more than just instruction in necessary skills. The women were testing her character, her willingness to persist through difficulty, her ability to accept criticism and correction without defensiveness. In their world, survival often depended on each member of the community being able to contribute meaningfully to the group's welfare. A woman who couldn't or wouldn't do her share would endanger everyone. Takoda appeared occasionally throughout the day, but he kept his distance and didn't interfere with the women's teaching. Sarah caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that mixed concern with approval, as if he were pleased by her efforts but worried about her ability to succeed. His restraint showed respect for the women's authority in their sphere of activity, but it also left Sarah feeling isolated and unsupported during the most challenging day of her life. Evening brought a new test when grandmother announced that Sarah would be expected to help prepare the communal meal for the entire village. This involved cooking techniques she had never seen before, using ingredients she couldn't identify, and working alongside women who had been perfecting these skills since childhood. The potential for embarrassing failure was enormous, and Sarah was acutely aware that the entire village would judge her competence based on the results. The cooking area was a complex arrangement of fire pits, stone grinding surfaces, and hanging baskets containing various foods and seasonings. Women moved around the space with practiced efficiency, each knowing exactly what needed to be done and when. Sarah felt like an intruder in their coordinated dance of preparation. "Watch first, then do," grandmother instructed. "See how each woman knows her work without being told. This is how Apache families survive, by working together without confusion or argument." Sarah observed carefully as the women transformed raw materials into the evening meal. The process was more complex and skillful than she had realized, requiring not just knowledge of techniques but also judgment about timing, proportions, and quality. When her turn came to contribute, she was clumsy and slow, but the other women helped her without making her feel completely incompetent. The most challenging moment came when Ayana deliberately gave Sarah instructions in rapid Apache, knowing perfectly well that she couldn't understand more than a few words. When Sarah looked confused and asked for clarification, Ayana spoke even faster and with obvious impatience, causing several other women to exchange glances. Grandmother intervened before the situation could escalate. She spoke firmly to Ayana in Apache, her tone suggesting reproof. Ayana responded defensively, but when grandmother spoke again, the younger woman fell silent and turned away. "What was that about?" Sarah asked quietly. "Ayana tries to make you fail by giving instructions you cannot understand. I tell her this is not honorable way to test enemy. True test shows person's real character, not their weakness in strange situation." Sarah felt grateful for grandmother's protection, but she also realized that she couldn't depend on such interventions indefinitely. Eventually, she would need to prove herself capable of holding her own in this community, and that meant learning to handle challenges like Ayana's hostility without outside help. As the communal meal was served and the village gathered to eat, Sarah found herself the object of considerable attention. The food she had helped prepare was shared among dozens of people, and she could see them evaluating her contribution along with everything else. The pressure was intense, but the sense of community was also stronger than anything she had experienced in her previous life. In her world back east, people lived in relative isolation. Even within crowded cities, neighbors might know each other's names but rarely shared resources or took responsibility for each other's welfare. Here, every person's actions affected the entire group, and everyone had both obligations and support that created genuine interdependence. After the meal, as the village settled into evening activities, Takoda finally approached Sarah directly. They walked together to a quiet area near the stream where they could talk without being overheard by the entire community. "How do you find your first day of learning Apache ways?" he asked. Sarah considered how to answer honestly, without complaining or asking for sympathy. "It's harder than I expected, but not impossible. Your grandmother is a good teacher, and most of the women seem willing to help me learn. I think I can adapt to the work, but the language is very difficult." And Ayana? Takada's expression showed that he was aware of the tension between the two women. "She's angry about your choice to marry me instead of her. I understand her feelings, but I can't change the situation. I can only try to prove that I'm worthy of the opportunity you've given me." Takoda nodded approvingly at this response. Ayana is proud and strong, but she is also young and has not learned to accept disappointment with grace. Her behavior today was noticed by the elders, and they will speak to her family about proper conduct toward a guest in our village. Sarah felt some relief at this news, but she also realized that having the elders intervene on her behalf might create resentment among some of the younger people. "I don't want to cause problems between families. Maybe it would be better if I found a way to work things out with Ayana directly." "You speak like Apache woman," Takoda said with obvious approval. "Thinking of harmony in village instead of only personal comfort. This gives me hope that my dreams guided me truly." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sound of flowing water and the distant voices of people preparing for night. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving at the village, feeling a moment of peace despite all the uncertainty surrounding her future. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. Of course. In your dreams about me, what did you see? What made you think I was meant to be part of your life? Dakota was quiet for a long time, apparently considering how to explain something that might not translate well into English concepts. I saw a woman with hair like corn silk who brought gifts to our people. Not gifts of objects, but gifts of new ways of thinking, new possibilities for survival in changing world. I saw our children learning from both Apache wisdom and white knowledge, becoming stronger than either people alone. The idea of having children with this man she barely knew was startling, but Sarah found herself intrigued rather than frightened by his vision of cultural blending. What if your dreams are wrong? What if I can't learn to be Apache, or what if our children don't fit in either world? Then we will face those challenges when they come. Apache people have always adapted to survive. Perhaps adaptation now means learning from other peoples instead of fighting them. Sarah could see the wisdom in this perspective, but she also understood why it would be controversial among people who were currently fighting for their very existence against white encroachment. Dakota's willingness to consider peaceful coexistence made him progressive by the standards of either culture, but it also made him potentially isolated from his own people. As they prepared to return to the village, Sarah felt a growing sense of connection to this man who had risked everything to protect her. He was thoughtful, principled, and capable of seeing beyond the immediate conflict to imagine a different kind of future. Whether or not his dreams proved prophetic, his character was becoming clearer to her with each conversation. Tomorrow will be more tests, he warned her, as they walked back toward the shelters. What kind of tests? Physical challenges. Apache women must be strong and brave as well as skilled in domestic work. You will need to prove you can endure hardship and contribute to defense of village if necessary. The prospect of physical tests was daunting for someone whose previous life had involved very little strenuous activity, but Sarah found herself looking forward to the challenge rather than dreading it. Each day of successfully meeting Apache expectations was building her confidence and giving her a sense of identity she had never experienced before. As she settled into a sleeping area for the second night, surrounded by the sounds and smells of the village, Sarah realized that she was beginning to feel less like a displaced outsider and more like someone who might actually belong here. The transition was far from complete, and there were still enormous challenges ahead, but she was starting to believe that adaptation might be possible. Tomorrow would bring new tests and new opportunities to prove herself. Tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that she had survived her first full day as a potential Apache woman, and that both Dakota and grandmother seemed pleased with her efforts. It was a small victory, but in her current circumstances, small victories felt like enormous achievements. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival at the Apache village, and the physical tests Dakota had warned her about had proven to be even more challenging than the domestic training. She had learned to climb the steep canyon walls that surrounded their settlement, to track animals through difficult terrain, and to move silently through the desert brush. Her hands were now calloused and strong, her body lean and hardened by constant physical activity, and her pale skin had been darkened by exposure to the relentless desert sun. More importantly, she had begun to think in Apache as well as English, to understand the subtle social dynamics that governed village life, and to feel genuinely connected to the women who had initially viewed her with such suspicion. Even Ayana had grudgingly begun to treat her with something approaching respect, though their relationship remained strained by the circumstances that had brought Sarah to the village. But on this particular morning, everything changed. Sarah was working with a group of women to gather medicinal plants in the hills above the village when they heard the sound that struck fear into every Apache heart: the thunder of many horses approaching at full gallop. The women immediately dropped their gathering baskets and moved to positions where they could see the approaching riders while remaining concealed themselves. Through the brush, Sarah could see a column of blue-uniformed cavalry soldiers riding hard toward the village. There were at least 50 of them, well-armed and clearly prepared for battle. At their head rode an officer whose bearing and confidence marked him as someone accustomed to command and victory. "Soldiers," breathed one of the women in Apache, her voice tight with fear. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized what this meant. The army had found the village, and they were coming in force to either capture or kill everyone in it. All the Apache men were away on a hunting expedition that was not expected to return for 2 days. The village was defended only by women, children, and a few elderly men who were no match for a full cavalry unit. The women around her immediately began moving toward the village, to warn the others and prepare for whatever defense might be possible. But Sarah found herself frozen by an impossible choice. These soldiers were her own people, whites like herself who would see her as a prisoner to be rescued, rather than a woman who had chosen to be here. If she revealed herself to them, she could return to the world she had known before, could reclaim the safety and familiarity of civilized life. But she would also be condemning Takoda's people to destruction. The cavalry would show no mercy to Apache who had taken a white woman, even if she told them the truth about how she came to be here. And Takoda himself would be hunted down and killed as soon as the soldiers learned that an Apache warrior had claimed a white woman as his wife. The other women were already running towards the village, but Sarah remained hidden in the brush, paralyzed by the magnitude of the decision she had to make. She could hear the soldiers getting closer, their horses' hooves pounding against the hard desert ground like a countdown to catastrophe. Everything she had learned about Apache culture told her that the honorable choice was clear. She was part of this community now, had accepted their protection and teaching, had been welcomed as daughter and sister and future wife. Her loyalty belonged to the people who had taken her in, not to the soldiers who had never shown any concern for her welfare until this moment. But the part of her mind that had been shaped by 22 years of white civilization whispered seductive arguments about returning to safety, about resuming the life she had planned before that fateful stagecoach journey. She could be a teacher again, could sleep in a real bed, could eat familiar food, and speak her native language with people who shared her cultural background. The sound of gunfire from the direction of the village made her decision for her. Sarah burst from her hiding place and ran toward the settlement, no longer caring about concealment or safety. The cavalry had arrived and begun their attack, and people she had come to love were in mortal danger. Whatever else might be true about her identity or her future, she could not stand by and watch innocent people be slaughtered. As she reached the edge of the village, the scene that greeted her was one of chaos and terror. Soldiers on horseback were riding through the settlement, firing at anyone who moved. Women were trying to gather their children and flee toward the hills, while the few old men who remained were attempting to mount some kind of defense with weapons that were no match for military rifles. Sarah could see grandmother near one of the shelters, helping a young mother carry her baby to safety. Without thinking, Sarah ran toward them just as a soldier on horseback rounded the corner of the shelter with his rifle raised. The cavalryman saw the old woman and the baby and took aim, apparently seeing them as legitimate targets in his mission to eliminate Apache resistance. "No!" Sarah screamed, throwing herself between the soldier and his intended victims. The soldier's rifle wavered as he suddenly found himself facing a white woman in Apache dress. His confusion gave grandmother and the mother time to escape, but it also focused the attention of other soldiers on Sarah's location. Within moments, she was surrounded by mounted cavalrymen, their weapons trained on her while their officer rode forward to assess this unexpected development. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm Captain William Morrison, United States Cavalry. Are you being held against your will by these Indians?" The name struck Sarah like a physical blow. Morrison. Could this be a relative of the young banker who had died in the stagecoach attack? The resemblance was unmistakable now that she looked at him more closely, and the coincidence seemed too cruel to be accidental. "Are you related to James Morrison?" she asked. The captain's face hardened. "He was my younger brother. He was killed 3 weeks ago in an Apache attack on a stagecoach. We've been tracking the war party responsible ever since." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the full implications of this encounter. This officer wasn't just conducting a routine patrol, he was seeking vengeance for his brother's death, and he had followed the trail directly to the village where she now lived. Her presence here would only confirm his belief that the Apache were responsible for what had happened to James. "Captain Morrison," she said carefully, "I was on that stagecoach with your brother. I'm very sorry for your loss." "Then you know what these savages are capable of," Morrison replied grimly. "How long have they been holding you prisoner? Have they harmed you?" Sarah looked around at the scene of destruction, at the Apache families fleeing in terror, at the soldiers who were systematically destroying everything the village had built. She thought about grandmother's patient teaching, about Takoda's gentle protection, about the women who had welcomed her, and the children who had begun to accept her as part of their extended family. "They haven't harmed me," she said quietly, "and I'm not a prisoner." Morrison's expression showed disbelief and anger. "Ma'am, I understand that captivity can affect a person's thinking, but you need to understand that you're safe now. These Indians killed my brother and abducted you. We're here to rescue you and bring them to justice." "Your brother died because he panicked and tried to grab a weapon," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "The Apache were willing to let us all go peacefully until he forced a confrontation. And I wasn't abducted. I chose to come here." The captain stared at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. Around them, his soldiers continued their systematic destruction of the village, burning shelters and scattering the carefully gathered supplies that meant survival for the families who lived here. "Ma'am," Morrison said finally, "I think these people have done something to your mind. No civilized woman would choose to live with savages. We're taking you back to Prescott where you can receive proper medical attention and remember who you really are." Sarah felt the weight of this moment pressing down on her like a physical force. Everything about her old life was represented by this officer and his men: the certainty, the familiar prejudices, the safety of belonging to the dominant culture. All she had to do was agree with his interpretation of events, allow herself to be rescued, and she could return to the world she had known. But as she looked at Captain Morrison's face, she saw not rescue, but destruction. He was a man consumed by grief and hatred, convinced that his version of events was the only truth worth considering. He would never believe that his brother's death had been unnecessary, would never accept that Apache people were capable of mercy or honor, would never understand that a white woman might choose to live differently than her culture demanded. "I remember exactly who I am," Sarah said clearly. "I'm a woman who refuses to be owned by anyone. Whether it's a domineering husband back east, or a cavalry captain who thinks he knows what's best for me, I'm staying here." Morrison's face flushed with anger and incredulity. "Ma'am, I'm ordering you to come with us for your own safety. These Indians are our enemies, and any white person who chooses to live with them is a traitor to their own race." "Then I suppose I'm a traitor," Sarah replied calmly, "but I'd rather be a traitor to a race that commits murder in the name of civilization than a loyal member of a culture that can't imagine any way of life except conquest and domination." The captain drew his pistol and pointed it at Sarah's chest. "Man, you're clearly not in your right mind. I'm taking you into protective custody, and these Indians are going to pay for what they've done to you." Sarah looked at the weapon aimed at her heart and felt a strange sense of peace. She had made a choice, and she was prepared to face the consequences. Whatever happened next, she would not betray the people who had become her family. "If you're going to shoot me for choosing my own life, then do it," she said quietly. "But understand that you'll be killing someone who is here by choice, not force." Morrison hesitated, clearly thrown off balance by her refusal to cooperate with his rescue mission. During his moment of uncertainty, a new sound reached them: the war cries of Apache warriors returning from their hunting expedition. Takoda and the other men had somehow learned of the attack and were riding hard toward the village, outnumbered but determined to defend their families. The captain immediately forgot about Sarah as he turned to meet this new threat. "Defensive positions!" he shouted to his men. "Prepare for attack." In the confusion that followed, Sarah managed to slip away from the soldiers and make her way toward the place where grandmother and the other women had taken refuge. She found the old woman crouched behind a large boulder, holding the baby whose life Sarah had saved, and watching the battle with grim determination. "You chose to stay," grandmother observed without surprise. "I chose my family," Sarah replied. The battle between the cavalry and the returning Apache warriors was brief but fierce. The soldiers had superior weapons and training, but the Apache fought with the desperation of people defending their homes and families. In the end, both sides suffered casualties, but neither achieved a decisive victory. As the shooting died down and both groups prepared for a standoff, Takoda appeared beside the boulder where Sarah and grandmother were hiding. His face was painted for war, and he carried a rifle he had taken from a fallen soldier. "Why did you not go with your people?" he asked Sarah. "Because they're not my people anymore," she replied. "You are my people now." Takoda's expression showed a mixture of joy and sorrow. "Then we fight together, and we die together if necessary." Sarah took his hand and felt the calluses that matched her own, the strength that had been developed through the same harsh training she had endured. "I refuse to be theirs," she said, echoing the words that had started this entire journey. "I choose to be ours." The standoff continued through the night, with both sides taking defensive positions and waiting for the other to make the first move. But as dawn approached, Sarah realized that this was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. Captain Morrison would not give up his quest for vengeance, and the territorial government would not tolerate white women choosing to live with Apache families. The life she had found in the village was about to be swept away by forces much larger than individual choice or personal preference. But as she looked at Dakota's face in the early morning light, she knew that she had made the right decision. Whatever came next, she would face it as an Apache woman, part of a family and a culture that valued strength, honor, and the courage to defend what mattered most. The sun rose over the desert, revealing a world forever changed by the choices made in darkness. Sarah McKenna, who had once sought nothing more than independence and security, had found something far more valuable and far more dangerous, a love worth fighting for, an identity worth dying for in the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier.